Since I don't have a watch on, I'll make sure my phone stopwatch lets me know. So Karen Armstrong has written a number of books, which include this concept of a reaction to modernity. And she states that religious fundamentalism is a reaction or a rejection of modernity. Karen Armstrong goes on to say, fundamentalism represents a rebellion against modern secular society, the separation of religion and politics. Basically, fundamentalists want to drag religion or God from the sidelines to which they have been relegated in modern secular society and bring them back to center stage. And in this, they've enjoyed considerable success in some ways, though in other ways it can represent a defeat for religion. And basically, that's a warning for us. Grant Wacker, who is part of the National Humanities Center at Duke Divinity School, says generic fundamentalism refers to a religious impulse, particularly evident in the 20th century, that seeks to recover and publicly institutionalize aspects of the past that modern life has obscured. It typically sees the secular state as the primary enemy. For the latter is more interested in education, democratic reforms, and economic progress than in preserving the spiritual dimension of life. Generic fundamentalism takes its clues from a sacred text that stands above criticism. It sees time-honored social distinctions and cultural patterns as rooted in the very nature of things, in the order of creation itself. That means clear-cut and stratified roles for men and women, parents and children, clergy and laity, sex. I could just go on and on. Historic fundamentalism shared all of the assumptions of generic fundamentalism, but also reflected several concerns particular to the religious setting of the United States at the turn of the century. Some of those concerns stem from broad changes in the culture, such as growing awareness of world religions, the teaching of human evolution, oh my God, and above all, the rise of biblical higher criticism. The last proved particularly troubling because it implied the absence of the supernatural and the purely human authorship of Scripture. Social changes of the earliest 20th century also fed the flames of protest, drawn primarily from ranks of old stock whites. Fundamentalists felt displaced by the waves of non-Protestant immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe flooding American cities. It almost sounds like today. They believed they had been betrayed by American statesmen who led the nation into an unresolved war with Germany's during World War I. They're cradled of destructive biblical criticism. They deployed the teaching of evolution in public schools, which they paid for with their taxes, and resented the elitism of professional educators who seemed often to scorn the values of traditional Christian families. So what I've talked about so far really kind of implies more of the U.S. But what I hope to do is kind of break this down into like three different messages. So today we will be talking about what are some indicators that led to this situation that came out of the 19th century. Because in reality, religious fundamentalism starts in the United States. And then it spreads worldwide during the 20th century. But most scholars believe that fundamentalism is generic and is a phenomenon of the 20th century United States. So today, I want to take a little time to see what are some of these. We've read what, I've quoted to you what fundamentalists said was all these problems for them, not for us, but for them. So what are some of the indicators that led to this situation? I mean, the reality in the 21st century is the religious fundamentalism is a huge part of our problem politically in the United States and worldwide. We see it in various geographical areas of the world. And now nearly all religions worldwide are affected by religious fundamentalism. I mean, it's not just Christianity. We know it's apparent in Judaism. It's apparent in Islam. It is apparent in Hinduism. And there is some in Buddhism, even though theirs is a little different. But it is apparent and it's there. So Karen Armstrong writes these books helping us to see that this is what's coming, so we need to be prepared for that. So what are some indicators in the 19th century that created this belief by a certain group, evangelicals basically in the United States, who felt like they were on the fringe of the world was passing them by? So I think one thing we could look at is Frankenstein. Anybody, y'all read the book Frankenstein? Do what? Saw the movie. Yeah, I've seen the movie many times and read the book once, but it's a Gothic novel, but there's a bunch of stuff in that book that's important. So what do you, I was reading about Frankenstein, kind of seeing what was a problem in it. What is a problem sometimes for us, especially us older adults? What do we have an issue with a lot of times? Technology? Is technology a problem sometimes for us? Yeah. Yeah, it's for me too. Yeah. Susie and I both got new computers here just a while back, and I went crazy all week long trying to figure that computer out. It took forever. I think I've finally figured out a little bit of it this morning with her help. But technology, today, technology is moving so fast. So in the late 18th century, what takes place? The Industrial Revolution starts to take place. And then in the 19th century, I mean, all kind of things take place. So what's the big monster? Who is the monster according to Mary Shelley in Frankenstein? Technology. She puts together a great story. I mean, she is an incredible writer who way ahead of her time. Her mother and her both were feminists, which is unusual as well. But technology, when did electricity come into being? When did? Late 1800s. I don't remember. No. Well, I mean, like we discovered electricity. Who in the United States discovered electricity? Or who we think? Franklin, yes. Around in the late 18th century, and then in the late 19th century, Thomas Edison starts to put together the electric light bulb and all this kind of thing. And then, of course, they come up with gas lights. Prior to the gas lights, churches didn't meet on Sunday nights. That is a phenomenon that came with technology into the 20th century. But technology was a problem for these people. They felt like it's taken away from what they believed. How about the time machine? Was that Orson Welles that wrote The Time Machine? And part of that, what was the idea from that? that that technology was moving so fast. So have you seen the new movie version of The Time Machine? Not the old one, the new one, newer one. It came out in the early 2000s. Have y'all seen that? Y'all need to go to the movie something here. We'd have to start having a movie night or something. But the idea was they were going too far. So in that movie, you see the moon's breaking up. They had done something in like the 24th century or something like that, the 25th century, where they had done something to the moon, so it was breaking up. It was creating a real problem. So there's this idea that technology is moving so fast. Parts of the society were able to keep up, and it fared them well. It fared us well. We like medical technology, don't we? I mean, we like the technology that saves our life, makes our life a little bit easier, that kind of thing. But the concept of religious fundamentalism is that technology has taken God's place. That's in reality what part of the issue there is. So one of the indicators is how fast technology started to speed up in the 19th century. And it does, of course, what it does in the 20th century is unreal. But the speed of technology and people having to adjust to it and how they felt about it. So another indicator, which comes in the later part of the 19th century, is Marxism. So Karl Marx lives in the 19th century. He dies before Lenin develops communism. So sometimes we mix those two, and we probably should not mix the two because really they're a little different from each other. But so Marx puts out his theories and along with Friedrich Engels, who's his collaborator, and they write a number of books and lay the foundation for some things that happened in the 20th century. But conservative evangelicals became the most ardent opposition to communism. So in the 20th century, who becomes the most public preacher in America who constantly talked about communism? Anybody? Reagan? No, preacher. Billy Graham, yeah.
He's a form of preacher.
Yeah, he's not my kind, but even though I came out of the Southern Baptist denomination, all my education's from a Southern Baptist seminary, but I took that left turn, so Billy Graham, yes. So over time, that group becomes this real opposition to it. Now, I'll talk about that the next time I have an opportunity to talk. We'll talk about the 20th century and really look at some of that. But I think it's interesting today that the conservative religious fundamentalist group supports Putin and some of that. I find that interesting how they kind of flip sides there. But one of the big things that helped to lead to religious fundamentalism was this higher biblical criticism. And it kind of develops in Germany and in Europe. But the United States, which has always been somewhat conservative on religion, rejected it pretty quickly, especially within some of the more Protestant groups. And higher criticism is an understanding about the historical context, even if it contradicts church tradition or even the words of the Bible itself. So even today, the last 40 years, we've heard a lot about the word inerrancy. That's part of that deal. But part of the 19th century had a guy named J.N. Darby. Anybody know him? Ever heard of him? So you older people, including myself, in the early 1970s, there was a book that came out, The Late Great Planet Earth. Any of you remember that? By Hal Lindsey? That's dispensationalism. There was that, here's again, that it developed in that book was this hatred of communism because they saw Moscow as the leader of this world order that was going to, the apocalypse and all that kind of thing. That Hal Lindsey tried to, put that into modern times. So that's part of that. Then there was a preacher out of Europe, out of England, Spurgeon, who kind of did some of the same thing. If you didn't go along with their strict versions of, now that doesn't mean that they abide by the whole Bible. They cherry pick, but they didn't like this higher biblical criticism. And World War I to them was bad because Germany was the place where it was born out of. And even today, you get into these more conservative seminaries, there is this context of this higher biblical criticism. You're not supposed to question anything. You're being told what to do. Authority, all this kind of thing. The Bible, God directed somebody to just write it all down, that kind of thing. That is their belief system. But this higher biblical criticism, as it developed in the late 19th century, is an indicator of what's going to take place in the 20th century. It'll grow over time. So what's one of the other big things would have happened in the 19th century? It wasn't just the United States. It actually started in England with one particular person, but it becomes a worldwide thing that we use in science today. Darwin, yes, exactly. Evolution. Evolution becomes the big thing. It's like the elephant in the room. Because in the 20th century, in the United States, the first public reality of religious fundamentalism is the Scopes monkey trial. So this is how it evolved out of that 19th century. And I think, Darwin, if you just really sat down and read his books, they're pretty good. I took a graduate course at SMU called Reading Darwin. It was not a science book. It was a literature class. But you had to take a number of his books and read them. So you saw different ways of looking at Darwin and evolution, but evolution is here to stay as long as we have science, I hope. I hope it doesn't disappear. But there is a part of this group, that this religious fundamentalism, that evolution is a problem. And it relates to that higher biblical criticism. And then the last thing within the 19th century that starts to take place is they're beginning to. So what happens in the middle part of the 19th century for the United States that changes a lot of things? Well, the Civil War. So you now no longer have slavery. And so the slaveholding states in the United States, to make it, and to do and to grow and to make all that money, their belief was they were going to export that concept of slavery. But slavery, due to the Civil War, the end of the Civil War, it disappeared. But that didn't mean the evangelicals of the South wanted it to disappear. And so there starts to be talk of losing this colonial concept that the white Europeans had. So their colonialism was worldwide, but in the 19th century, you start to see some discussions within the European countries and the United States to back away from some of the colonials. So then when you come into the 20th century, it starts to take place, but of course World War II really has a big impact on it. But there is this discussion. There's a loss of slavery. The world kind of does not see slavery as a good thing anymore, and they're starting to question colonialism. So these are all ideas that when I was reading that from Grant Wacker, he talks about how the fundamentalists in the United States in the late 19th century and the early 20th century did not like that all of a sudden there are Southern Europeans and Eastern Europeans who are not evangelical or mainline Protestant type groups coming into America. Some of them, a lot of Catholic. The evangelicals were very anti-Catholic in the 19th century and into the 20th century. It's starting to change as fundamentalism now takes evangelicals, conservative Catholics, Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, and now collaborates together in some of our political realm. But so now what's happening in the 20th century is the 21st century, you're starting to see the religious fundamentalism mixed with nationalism, and that's the big thing. But the reality is, how did we get to where we're at right now? So we started to see this. Technology starts to take place. It's growing. People are really grasping it. It's becoming a bigger part of their life. There are new political philosophies starting to generate around the world, Marxism, and that's becoming a real problem. There's this higher biblical criticism, so people are saying the Bible's not true, and so that was a problem for those people. And then evolution comes to take place, and then there's this loss of this colonialism starts to lose ground. So this is what takes place, what pushes that religious fundamentalism that really more evolves in the early 20th century with evangelical groups. And it's native to the United States. Now it'll grow and it's a worldwide problem now, but this is how it all first starts out. And to be able to deal with that and in the future to combat that, I'm a big believer in history, and that is we have to learn how it got going. And this is how it started. Thank you.
Got a question for you.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that U.S. fundamentalism was really one of the big hotspots that it popped up and
Yes.
influenced a bunch of other countries.
Yes.
Did our extreme fundamentalism with American Christian fundamentalism, did it influence the Iranian Revolution and Shia Islam fundamentalism, military, like their military?
I would say it does. I mean, that's part of what I believe, that it did have some influence. Not that they liked those people and went over there to do it. It's just, I think the Islamic fundamentalism is what we're talking about. Notice what was happening with them. Islam, when the colonialism was started to dissipate in Islamic countries started, the fall of the Ottoman Empire helps to open that door. And in some of those other countries like Egypt, Iraq, all these various countries that later become pretty strong countries within the Islamic world, they decided they wanted to, when they became an independent country, they decided they wanted to do it their way. They didn't want to be necessarily influenced. They didn't want England still hanging around telling them what to do, or they didn't want the Belgians still telling them what to do. They wanted to do it their way. And it appears, well, I don't think initially it was more political, but as time went on, I think they saw what fundamentalists in America had done, and they liked that, and so they picked up on it.
It's working pretty good.
Yes, yeah, I agree. It's good point. Very good point. Anybody else? You ready to become a fundamentalist?